You're listening to a
You're
small
listening
good
to-
thing.
listening to a small
You're
good
listening
thing.
to a small
To a small good thing.
Good
The
thing.
Small Good Thing with Steve Zelt.
with Steve Zelt.
I'm Steve Zelt. On this episode, I want to talk about the movie Paterson. The movie came out exactly 2 years ago, but I just saw it recently. If you have Amazon Prime, it's playing now there, and I recommend that you go take a look at it. Paterson stars Adam Driver. You might recognize him as Kylo Ren in the last few Star Wars movies. In this movie, he plays a man named Paterson, living in the city of Paterson, which is a real city in New Jersey. And to help me talk about this movie, I'm excited to say that my friend Greg Emilio has agreed to lend his insights. And one reason why Greg, I think, is the ideal person to do this is because Paterson, that is Adam Driver's character in the movie, drives a bus by day, but he also writes poetry. And Greg is a poet. His poetry and his essays have appeared in many periodicals, such as Midwestern Gothic, Permafrost, Pleiades, Spoon River, Poetry Review, and others. Recently, he was selected for the 2018 Best New Poets Anthology, and he won the Friction 2018 Summer Poetry Contest. He's the nonfiction editor at New South and a PhD candidate in English at Georgia State University in Atlanta, and also he moonlights as a bartender. Thank you so much for being on my show, Greg. I just think it's so great that we're talking about a bus driver who's also a poet, and you tend bar and also are a poet.
Yeah, Steve, thanks for having me. Excited to take a crack at Paterson. It's such a good movie.
It's a great movie. I want to talk to you about poetry and your poetry a little bit later in the show. But right now, what I want to do is I just want to jump right into the movie, if that's okay with you. So here's my first question. Greg, why is Paterson a good movie for people to see? Alyssa Wilkinson, who is the lead film critic for Vox, said it's one of those movies where I thought, if I watched this movie every week of my life, I would probably be a better person. Why should people see this movie, in your opinion?
Well, I think we need to have more films like Paterson in that it's a movie that's closer to real life, I think. And it's important to see that on the screen, to not just watch blockbuster movies, and to see something that might reflect your own life. And I think the film really highlights that daily life, mundane as it can be, is really, really beautiful and meaningful and worth thinking about and making art about. I think that's why the movie is valuable right now and why people should watch it.
I want to talk about some of the specifics in the movie. I know that you teach English, and I teach English. One of the things I teach my English students is that one way to think about a movie, or any narrative for that matter, and what it's saying, is to identify the main conflict in the narrative. But this movie, Paterson, doesn't seem to have a conflict, or does it? Why don't you tell us about the character Paterson and what happens in his story and what goes on? Maybe you can just talk a little bit about the plot, if there is a plot.
Yeah, that's a good question. I was actually thinking about that question last night. You said, what is the conflict in Paterson? And it's kind of tricky to identify the conflict because it's a movie that the plot is pretty thin. In other words, it's not plot driven. It's not about watching necessarily to see what happens next. So it's not narratively, quite so tight as, say, an action movie or a suspense movie. But the movie is about, this bus driver named Paterson living in Paterson, New Jersey. You get to see him wake up each morning. And so there's like this repetition and routine built into the structure of the film. Every morning you see him wake up next to his wife, Flora, and kind of share these really beautiful, intimate, dreamy moments. And then you see him eat breakfast, Cheerios, I think it is, every morning, and then walk to work.
Yes.
And then that ends at the end of kind of each night. He has dinner with his wife, and then he takes the dog for a walk and goes out for a beer at the bar, and that's where each day ends. And then he wakes up again, and the whole day repeats again. So the structure is really nice. It moves forward I think in a pleasing way. But the movie, again, it's not, a week. We all go through these weeks, and they're part of that mundane kind of stuff that we have to do. But the movie is so rich in that it's threaded through with all these moments of clarity, all these kind of moments where, I don't know, his life seems to kind of hold still or open up, and something cracks open and he gets to see some kind of insight, and he tries to commit it to first in just words to his head, talking to himself essentially, and then he puts it down on paper. The movie captures all of that. It's the life that we all live, I think, in a way.
I want to talk about, too, maybe you might say something about Golshifteh Farahani. That's the woman who plays Laura. Wonderful. Yeah. I think she's Iranian. Beautiful woman, beautiful actress, beautiful part. She plays Laura, Paterson's wife, and she's not like Paterson. What is her role in the movie?
Laura's great. Such a good character. She provides what little tension the movie has comes from Laura, because you get to, it's essentially a movie with like 3 or 4 main characters, including their dog. And Laura's, the second most significant character. And she's kind of, whereas Paterson is, like I said, he's kind of all under the surface. All of his inner life doesn't really manifest outwardly very much. He's very within himself and centered. Whereas Laura is the opposite. She is someone who is wildly expressive, and she essentially stays at home while Paterson is doing his rounds on the bus, and every day she has some new art project, whether it's painting the drapes or baking cupcakes or fashioning her own clothes or buying a guitar. And so she is, whereas Paterson is quiet, her art and her kind of passion is very loud, and it reveals itself. And so there's a really interesting dynamic between them, because they both are very much artistic people, creative people, but Paterson's the poet who would rather write kind of in his secret journal, and he doesn't really care if anyone sees what he's working on. But for her, it's very much performative. She likes for people to eat her cupcakes, and she likes for Paterson to come home and see what she's done to the house, what new art project she's taking on. And she picks up the guitar because she wants him at least to hear her music. So they have a just really interesting dynamic, and I think it's Jarmusch just saying, like, there are lots of different ways you can be creative, and there are just 2 different ways, and they kind of complement each other really nicely in the movie.
And they love each other.
Oh yeah. The movie is also refreshing because it's a portrait of marriage as perhaps like in a partnership in perhaps its best form. They don't exactly rely on each other for their happiness, because they all they both are generating their own kind of fulfillment, I think. But when they come together, you can tell it's probably the best part of each other's day. You know what I mean?
Yes, and I'm glad you used that word, refreshing. Other critics have commented on this too. Just a kind of refreshing look at marital love. She is a big supporter of Paterson and his writing. That kind of generates one of the plot devices in the movie too, is that she is insisting on him to publish his work, to at least print it out, because everything Paterson does is handwritten in a little journal, and so each day she's reminding him, when are you gonna at least print out your poems? When are you gonna send them out into the world for people to see? She's a supporter in his muse, and believes that his work is worth spreading into the world. Yes. It's lovely too. Sometimes she'll ask him to read a poem that he's written, or
Yeah.
read one of his favorite poems by one of his favorite poets, William Carlos Williams, who of course lived in Paterson, New Jersey, wrote a large book, a poem about Paterson, and
Yeah.
she is very supportive. He writes all his poems in his what's he call it, his secret notebook, but he doesn't publish them. Do you have any thought about why he doesn't? Did that ring any kind of, what did that mean to you?
It rings a good bell. It's nice. It's good to see that this thing that he does, this very artistic, creative work, that takes a lot of effort. Paterson does not have a cell phone. He does not, as far as we can see, ever use the internet. It takes patience and time to write or read anything, let alone a poem. And he does this seemingly because it satisfies him. And also, he writes his wife love poems, so he does it for her as an expression of his love. But I also think that he gets an extreme satisfaction out of doing this daily kind of devotional, almost prayer-like kind of observations about the world and his place in it, the things that he notices, and the things that are important, just the fabric of daily life.
Now, part of Paterson's routine is, maybe not every night, but many nights, he takes the dog out for a walk, and he walks into the little town of Paterson, and he ties up the dog there on the sidewalk, and he goes. What's this? Marvin, right?
Marvin.
And Marvin's kind of his own personality there. He has a part to play, a critical part to play in the development of the movie. But Paterson goes to a bar, and it's a small bar, a friendly bar. But behind the cash register in the bar, the bartender puts up pictures or newspaper clippings or articles of people who either came from the city of Paterson or have had or do have some significant relationship to the city. For example, Lou Costello of the famous Abbott and Costello comedy team actually was from Paterson, and Lou Costello has his own park there in Paterson, and I think we get a shot of the bus driving by the Lou Costello Park. Also, there's Reuben the Hurricane Carter, who was somewhat immortalized by Bob Dylan's song back in the 70s, and then the movie with Denzel Washington, who played the Hurricane. And Hurricane Carter was a man who was falsely convicted for a murder in a bar in Paterson. And then, of course, there's William Carlos Williams, the famous American poet, and I think it's significant, who also did not make his living as a poet, but was a pediatrician in Paterson, New Jersey. He had delivered thousands of babies and wrote poetry on the side. And Allen Ginsberg grew up there. What is the significance of Paterson, the place? Could this story take place in any other city?
Good question. I think Jarmusch teases you a lot about Paterson. I mean,
yes,
he makes you want to believe there is something very, very significant about this small eastern town. His character is named Paterson, and he lives in Paterson, and that character's favorite poet wrote a poem called Paterson and also lived there. So it really echoes a lot, and it goes along with the movie has all these twins in it. I don't know if you remember that. There's this repetition of twins, lots of them popping up. And, I mean, could the film take place anywhere else? I don't think so. But I think what's so brilliant about it is that Jarmusch obviously knows the area so well and knows about all these figures that he wrote a film that couldn't take place anywhere else, because every little town, every city is so unique. And I think lots of towns have these kind of this ensemble of people who had been there or people who came from there. And I mean, really, Paterson, it has a few celebrities, I guess, but none really. I mean, we're talking about poets and, Hurricane Carter's obviously, and Abbott and Costello are the more famous examples, but it's about kind of, I don't know, I think the sub-celebrities, just the people who live there who do important things, like William Carlos Williams. So I don't know. Yeah, I think he has a lot of fun by creating this movie and calling it Paterson and kind of messing with your expectations. I think it could have taken place somewhere else, a similar kind of story, but it would be a different movie and it would involve different characters for sure.
I want to come back to the film, and also you and your poetry in a second. But before I do that, I just want to put this little commercial in for the podcast. If you've been listening to A Small Good Thing and you want to support the podcast, there are several ways you can do that. One way is you can go to iTunes or Apple Podcasts and you can leave a comment. And I've left the link for you in the show notes below, so you can do that right now if you want. Also, you can leave a 1 or a 5-star rating. That's a trick that I learned from Andrew Cochran, who was one of my guests in the last episode. No 2 or 3 or 4-star ratings, just a 1-star rating, which is like a thumbs down, or preferably a 5-star rating, which is like a thumbs up. And if you do that, that helps boost the visibility for the podcast. So if you could do that now, put the podcast on pause maybe, or right afterwards, I'd be much obliged. All right, Greg, I want to turn the corner a little bit right now and talk a little bit more specifically about poetry and you as a poet and some of your thoughts there. And I'm going to see if I can do this. I'm going to just start with myself briefly, how I came to poetry. And I was thinking about how I came to poetry, and I'll try to keep it brief. There are kind of two strands. When I was in my early 40s, I had a crisis in my life. And I was floundering, and I was in a dark place. And suddenly I was connected, somehow or another, I got connected to poetry. I began reading poetry, and literally I remember at that time thinking to myself, and even now, poetry saved me. And it wasn't the only thing that saved me, but it was instrumental in saving me. And when I say saving me, what it did for me is it suddenly brought to my consciousness, the poets that I was reading, that suddenly I realized I wasn't alone, and that also these people who were talking, they saw the world and life the way I saw it, and they were saying things that I could never say, and they were saying it. And in a sense, it saved me because the poetry grounded me back into life in a certain kind of way. I also came to poetry partly because of my upbringing. A significant formative factor for me was I grew up in a liturgical church. And in a liturgical church, words are paramount, particularly ordered and ritualistic words. It's interesting that you thought of Paterson as kind of doing and performing a devotional, and it's true. And so I came to the love of words early on, and I think I liked words and even poetry as a younger man, but it became very vital to me at a critical time in my life. And since that time, I've never stopped reading poetry. My question to you is, how did you come to poetry? And then if you think of yourself as a poet, and I think you do, how did you become a poet? Do you in any way identify with Paterson? What is your journey?
Oh, that's hard to answer, but worth thinking about. I think I, like you, came to poetry largely through a love of language. You said it's, owing to some of your religious upbringing and having a probably a pretty profound respect for the liturgy. And I think for me, that's pretty essential to who I am as a person, as well as someone who tries to write poetry. I think there is there's a spiritual yearning that comes with wanting to write something like this. And I've always felt tapped into that, being brought up, in my Christian household. It was, I think, super formative, and being so attracted to stories and looking for meaning and knowing that there must be something else. There must be some deep hidden thing at the core of everything. And I don't know, when you write a poem, when you try to use language as a tool to access it, I think you're doing something, incredibly worthwhile, and something that's timeless, and something that makes you very, very human. So I think I come to poetry through a love of words primarily, and then also through a wanting to figure things out, wanting there to be more than just the surface of the world, and hoping to find, like I said, those kind of deeper hidden meanings in everything, to give your life meaning. I think that's why I write poetry. And it's the same reason why I read poetry, is because you want to learn about other people. You want to see your own experience reflected in others, and you want to figure out what it means to be a human, and what it means to be a human in the context of your trials and your hardships, and also your joys and your blessings. And language is our best way of recording those things. So,
you recently wrote a poem that had a nod towards Andrew Hudgens.
Yeah.
Would you be willing to read that?
I'd be
poem?
happy to. Yeah. So Andrew Hudgens, very fine American poet. He's, I guess, a poet of some faith and likes to engage Christian kind of themes and rituals in his work, but he does so in a complex way, a very complicated relationship to God and into his own faith, and therefore he humanizes the whole subject. He wrote a poem called Heat Lightning in a Time of Drought, and it's a poem about basically him going through a divorce, and he's kind of racked with sorrow and guilt, and he's thinking about all these memories that he shared with his ex-wife, and that's kind of takes form in the metaphor of lightning striking the Texas landscape when it's dry and there is no rain, and that being just kind of otherworldly and surreal and strange. And I guess I wrote the poem a couple years ago, but it just recently got published by Letters Journal, a journal that Yale puts out that kind of focuses on poetry that leans spiritual, I guess. So I thought it was a good kind of model, an example to bounce off of, to kind of echo and pay homage to. So my poem's called Saying Grace in a Time of Drought. And I guess the only things that you really need to know is that when I wrote it, I was living in an apartment in Atlanta, Georgia, and there was a bar just up the street from me called the Atlanta Eagle, and it's really famous in the city for being a gay bar. And I used to live next to it, so occasionally I would see foot traffic coming to and fro, and some of that works its way into the poem. So this is a Saying Grace in a Time of Drought after Andrew Hudgens. I can't believe you danced with him, one man shouts at another as they stagger out of the Atlanta Eagle and quarrel in front of my apartment. I smoke in the shadows, snooping behind a hedge. A roach lumbers along a stone wall. Cicadas click viciously. August, the city thrums in a thick mug of sweat. I pray that the lovers can work it out, go back to grinding in the neon glow. Inside, my ribeyes roiling in a bath of butter, blistered garlic, crackling rosemary. So I leave the lovers on stage to harangue the night away. In Old English, hunger means desire with longing. So of course, I'm thinking of a woman who I never thought would leave, who, of course, did. Once I awoke to a roach drowning in the coupe glass she left on the sill, the insect flailing in boozy, life-ending ecstasy. Outside, the couple gnashes their teeth, a choked, "I fucking love you," cracking the insect fever pitch. Too impatient to let it rest, I slice into the steak. The blood seeps onto the plate, and I wonder about the ways we're hardwired for pleasure, how the body rewards us for outpacing death, the chiasmus of food and sex. This woman. But what's the use telling you her eyes had the hard glint of polished obsidian? That I was the first man to cook a steak for her? That she'd mouth a silent prayer over her food like it was God-given? Now framed by the kitchen window, the lovers will not stop breaking up, wringing out their love, overacting what might be the most important moment of their lives. Grace, we say, because life is full of undeserved hunger. The roaches are out tonight, prowling for crumbs, cracks, for the sugar in our cocktails. But why bother telling you? The meat's getting cold.
What I liked about your poem, and I think it ties in so well with the movie Paterson, is, and that maybe that people have a hard time understanding, is it's a way of stopping life and looking at life and heightening life, our life, your life, with language. And that gives us meaning. And then we can even share that meaning with other people through poetry. And I think that's one of the things that saved me when I was in my 40s by reading poetry. I wanted to see if we can make this turn. I don't know if we can. I want to go back to the end of the movie of Paterson. There is a climax, something happens. And then there's the denouement, which is the fancy word for how is the whole movie going to come out. And how do we say? Are we going to do we want to talk about that ending? Is that a spoiler? What happens at the end? What can we say about the ending of that movie?
Well, I don't think it's going to spoil the film. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because the movie's not about the punchline at the end of it. But are you wanting to talk about the Japanese man who Paterson runs into at the end?
Yes, Paterson. Something happens, and he
maybe we can leave that vague.
And something happens to where it appears that he has been stopped in his writing of poetry. And then something happens. He goes to the Passaic waterfalls in Paterson, and he meets a Japanese man. And what do we, without having to play the whole thing out, what happens there for Paterson that's important that I think Jarmusch wants to tell us?
Well, like in so much of the movie, it's these quiet, very subdued encounters with strangers that seem to create sparks. And so at the end of this movie, he encounters a poet from Japan, a man who says, "I breathe poetry," as he breathes deeply. And he explains that he came to Paterson, New Jersey to see the town of the famous poet William Carlos Williams. And he's able to just share a quiet, contemplative moment with Paterson. And he kind of throws it all into perspective, I think, for Paterson. Throws it back into perspective. That
and
kind of
gives him a gift. He gives him a gift, I think.
Yeah.
Another notebook. Something has happened in Paterson's notebook. And it's literally, I was kind of laughing because it's literally an aha moment. Because the Japanese fellow would ask a question and Paterson would respond, and the Japanese man would say, aha. And aha. And it's kind of like an aha moment. And we leave Paterson again, and for me, and you can maybe say differently, but for me, this movie opens up in the end, and I think what maybe Jarmusch is saying, it's about poetry, but it's about even, you don't have to be a poet to receive this good message from this movie. It's about, for me, one possible way is vocation or calling, and the need to, whatever our vocation is, whatever our calling is, in whatever city we live in, whether we're known or not known, it's important and vital that we continue to pursue faithfully our vocation, whatever it is. And I think that's why Alyssa Wilkerson said that if she could watch this movie every week, she would just be a better person. And I think that's, to me, the message that Jarmusch might be wanting to send is, yes, this all takes place in Paterson, and there's Lou Costello, and there's the hurricane, but every city has people in it, and they're doing something too. And it's important that whatever it is we're called to, or we feel we're called to, that we do that thing. Do you agree, or would you add to that?
Oh, I love that. So well said. Yeah, and it's ultimately a kind of affirmation of being okay doing what you're doing. And I think we're taught to think of our lives as insignificant. I think kind of pop culture tells us that if you're not, a movie star or, a politician or doing something really, really important, that your life's not important. I don't think that's true. I think that's long been a project of poetry. And I think it's a project of the movies, just to remind you that everything you do has meaning, that there is no one else gets to live your exact life. And that's extremely precious and important, and it's absolutely worth thinking about. So not only doing your vocation, but think about it, contemplate it, allow yourself to meditate on the world around you. And I think if we all did that, like that reviewer said, I think we'd all be better people and we'd live in a better world.
My friend, you've left the audience with a small good thing. I think even something more than a small good thing. I thank you very much, Greg, for being on the show. I wish you success with your doctoral program, and I have positive feelings about that I will maybe be calling you doctor soon in the near future. And I'm hoping that maybe one day you'll be coming back on the show with me and we can think of something else to talk about. Would you be willing to do that?
Steve, I'd love that. Thank you so much for having me on. It's a real pleasure to talk with you.
The music you're listening to is by Audio Binger, and the song is appropriately entitled The Garden State.